Today you guys are getting a 2-for-1. We're going to be taking a look at the Canon EOS RP, and since so many of you have been requesting that I review the Canon M50, that's exactly what we're going to be comparing it to. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and yabba dabba doo. Alright, so chances are this probably isn't the first video you've seen on the EOS RP. I can almost guarantee that's the case for the M50. So I'm going to do my best to try and skip more of the redundant specs and common complaints that you've probably already heard a dozen times, and give you my hopefully unique impressions. But before we do that, I'd like to thank Camera Canada for supplying me with all of the Canon gear that I use to make this video. I don't buy a lot of Canon gear myself these days, but I do use Camera Canada for all my other camera needs, and I highly recommend them for their vast product knowledge and terrific customer service. So if you're looking to get any of the products that we mentioned in this video, make sure you check their links in the description below. So when the EOS R came out, I made a video dedicated to the pleasant surprises and underrated features that I thought that camera had. So let's start out by seeing how many of those features made it into the EOS RP. The first thing I loved about the EOS R was the EF to RF lens mount adapter that you got for free. And that's still the case with the RP. You still get this excellent adapter for free, and it still works beautifully. I tested it on my favorite Canon lens, the 35mm f1.4 Mark II, and it worked just as well as I would have expected it to work on an EF camera. The RP still has manual focus peaking, but it doesn't have that cool focus guide that I liked so much on the EOS R. So no more fun little green box and little arrows when manual focusing. They also removed that dust protecting shutter feature on the R that would happen when you turn off the camera. On the RP, when you turn the camera off, the sensor still stays exposed. And this is kind of unfortunate because I thought that was a pretty novel feature on the R, and I wish that it would have made it down to the RP. But one thing they've removed on the RP that I approve of is that touch bar thing. I never liked it on the R, and I'm glad that it's gone, but I do wish that they would have used that extra space to make the AF on button a little bit bigger and take it off that funky angle. Seems like a little bit of a missed opportunity, but overall, I think that's a bit of an improvement. Lastly, it still has the fantastic display customization options that I liked on the R, but sadly, the histogram still disappears when recording, just like the R. Overall, I still really like the design, and I'm okay with the top LCD being missing on the RP that was featured on the R because I never really used it. I really like the grip and the textures. Overall, I just think it looks and feels pretty great. It's lower resolution than the R and is missing a few key features that I'm sure you've heard before in other reviews. There's no dual pixel autofocus in 4K, there's no 24 frames per second in 1080p, no C-Log, and no 10-bit over HDMI, and so on. But it is smaller, lighter, and much cheaper. At only $1,300 US dollars or $1,700 Canadian, it's one of the cheapest full-frame solutions available. So comparing it to a camera that cost $1,000 more probably isn't going to yield great results. But my biggest issue with the EOS R was that I didn't feel that it was a very good value, but perhaps the RP is. So let's talk about what the RP excels at. First off, it takes nice pictures. You get all the benefits of full frame, including pretty fantastic low light performance. As per usual with Canon, its dynamic range is nowhere near what some of the competition can produce, but if you're someone who cares more about getting the stops that it can create to be clean and pleasing, this camera does a pretty good job. I would, however, suggest that there are some limitations on the scenarios in which this camera can be used. For instance, I wouldn't recommend it for sports and wildlife shooting. It only has a 4 frames per second burst in continuous autofocus, and it's not the fastest focuser I've seen from Canon. One thing I can say about the burst mode on this camera that's pretty cool is that it essentially has an unlimited buffer. It's probably because the camera can't take that many frames to begin with, but it's able to clear them before it ever runs out. And that's kind of neat. The eye detection is pretty good, and I like that you can switch the eyes with a single press, and for stationary subjects it has an excellent hit rate. But the face does have to be sort of large in the frame in order for the eye detection to kick in, so if you're used to a Sony system, you might find this one a little bit underwhelming. Still life will be a breeze for this camera, but erratic subjects rapidly approaching the lens seem to be a bit too much for the autofocus system to handle at times, especially when they get close. It does have AF customization in the menu, but even when everything is set to max, I still found it a little bit slower than what I've come to expect from the competition. And it's not weather sealed, so when you factor all these aspects together, it kind of limits its usefulness to calm weather landscapes and predictable portraiture, as well as still life and studio work where maximum dynamic range isn't crucial. Now those may sound like serious limitations, and I suppose they are, but this camera will still be applicable to a huge amount of photographers, even if you remove those categories. Battery life is another concern, however, it just doesn't last that long. I only got about 450 mixed LCD and EVF shots, and that's doing everything I could to save the battery life, and I got less than 90 minutes of record time. And when I mixed photo and video, I only got about 200 to 250 shots and 45 minutes of record time, and that's just not a lot for a full frame camera, and that's because the RP is actually using a smaller battery, the LP-E17. Now speaking of video, the 1080p video is quite good, but as many people have already pointed out, it doesn't have 24 frames per second in 1080p. but the autofocus is quite impressive in video mode. The point-to-point focusing is responsive and accurate, the tap-to-focus produces nice transitions, and the face and eye tracking is also very good. 4K video, on the other hand, is a non-starter. It's probably best to think of this as a 1080p camera because the 4K has a huge crop and completely unusable autofocus. It just drifts in and out and does pretty much whatever it wants, so unless you want to shoot on manual lenses with a 1.6 times crop, I'd probably pass on the 4K. Another thing it does well for video though, however, is separating your exposure settings between photo and video. You can just switch back and forth between the modes and don't have to worry about re-putting in your video shutter speeds. I always appreciate it when a camera does this. The dials did take some getting used to though, as there are fewer buttons than on the previous camera, and it does require some combination presses in order to change ISO and drive modes. But the touchscreen on this camera is fantastic and makes these changes easier to perform if you want to go that route, and the touchscreen is also fully capable in the menu as well and is fast and responsive. I tested the kit lens combo, which includes the RF 24-105 f4. It's a very good lens, very sharp, and probably one of the best standard zooms, at least at f4, that I've ever used. However, it is a bit too big for the body because the RP is a shorter camera, so it just kind of rolls around when you set this down on a flat surface because of the lens girth. Now there are grip extensions that make this a bit better, which you get included for free if you're a US shopper, but Canadian shoppers get an extra battery instead. But don't feel compelled to go with the kit if you already own Canon lenses or you prefer a certain focal length, because the included mount adapter works flawlessly. So is the EOS RP worth $1,300? Well, for the most part, I'd say yes. It's cheaper than the 6D Mark II, and it's pretty much a mirrorless clone of that camera, but you get a smaller, more compact body, as well as some of those computational features we just talked about. Now the 6D Mark II is better weather sealed and shoots a little bit faster, but for $200 less, I think I'd probably get the RP, and overall, it allows for an entrance into full frame at Canon's best price yet. But what about the M50? Just as easy as it is to claim that this is the mirrorless 6D, you could also make the claim that it's the full-frame M50, and it compares surprisingly close to that camera. Now the M50 is a lot smaller and has even fewer buttons, so it might take you a little while to get quick at exposing or adjusting focus, but it does have that same excellent touchscreen to make that process easier. It also has all those awesome display customization options we were talking about on the RP, except for one thing about audio levels, which we'll get into a bit later, and it also has that same problem with the disappearing histogram. The M50 has a very similar resolution to the RP and has very similar video options, so again, no C-Log, no 10-bit over HDMI, and no dual pixel autofocus in 4K, but it does have 24 frames per second in 1080p. But just like in the RP, the 4K has a huge crop and the autofocus just does whatever it wants when you're in that setting, so again, consider this a 1080p camera. And I would say that the usage scenarios that I described for the RP are also true for the M50, but I would suggest that the M50 is even more limited when it comes to sports and wildlife. The autofocus sensitivity can't be customized in the same way for erratic movement, and there's a bit more drag in the autofocus responsiveness when compared to the RP. But it does have a faster drive speed when using servo. You can get about 7.4 frames per second on the Canon M50 when using continuous autofocus, up from the 4 frames per second on the Canon RP, but it does have a smaller buffer, so you can only maintain that frame rate for about 1 to 2 seconds, where you can maintain it pretty much indefinitely on the RP. One thing I like about the M50 that's also on the RP that I forgot to mention is that there's no blackout when shooting in burst mode. You just see a sort of subtle freezing of the frames, but the screen never goes black, and that's pretty great. The M50 also isn't weather sealed, and it doesn't have quite the same face and eye detection. It does have it, but the eye detection only works in one-shot mode, which is kind of silly unless both you and your subject are staying still. I also found you had to be even closer or fill up more of the frame in order for the eye detection to kick in on the M50 than you did on the RP, and you can't switch eyes with a single button press like you can on the RP. The autofocus in video mode is still very good in 1080p on the M50, but it does drag a little bit more when moving in and out when compared to the RP. The RP only loses focus for a fraction of a second, but on the M50 this lasts a little bit longer and will probably be noticeable in your footage. But if you make slow movements, this won't really be that big of an issue. But overall, I'd put it in the same category of calm weather landscapes and predictable portraiture, as well as still life and studio work where maximum dynamic range isn't crucial. But you will have to consider the reduced low light capabilities on the M50 due to its smaller sensor. I'd say it's pretty good up to ISO 3200, but you'll get a similar noise level on the RP at 12,800. And I'd say the 12,800 on the RP is quite good considering. However, the M50 might fulfill the role of travel camera a bit better than the RP due to its compact size and battery life. Because despite all the complaints I'd heard about the battery life on the M50, I actually found it to be quite satisfactory and was significantly longer than the battery life on the RP. I was able to get just under 2 hours of recording time in 1080p video and close to 700 shots of mixed display stills. And when I did that 250 shots and 45 minutes of record time mixed photo and video battery life test that exhausted the Canon RP, I still had 2 bars left when doing that on the M50. The image quality is very similar between the two when shooting at lower ISOs, especially in the 1080p video. I found the results to be very close. Neither of these cameras have proper IBIS, but they both do offer a digital stabilization that works in video mode by cropping in the image a little bit to compensate for shakes that way. It does help, but I don't generally like this type of stabilization and generally opt to disable it. The M50 also maintains separate settings for photo and video and also has the same articulating screen with, I believe, the same resolution as the RP. You can also use a mount adapter for the M50 for putting on your favorite Canon EF lenses, but it does not come included in the package for free. But it does come with a kit lens at a very affordable price of $650 US or $850 Canadian, where the kit on the RP jacks the price up from $1,300 to $2,200. So if you just compare the bodies only, the RP costs twice as much as the M50, but if you compare the kits, the RP kit is over 3 times more. Now, the kit lens that comes with the RP is significantly better than the kit lens that comes with the M50, but I have seen some more comparable kits that were included with the RP for about $1,600, so in that case, kit to kit would be about 2.5 times more for the RP. Now, there are a few other differences worth noting about the two systems other than the sensor size, the first being that the M50 does not have a headphone jack where the RP does. But both have a microphone jack and have very similar audio performance. In fact, the M50 actually recorded a little bit cleaner, with the noise level sitting a few dB lower. Now, the RP has a bit more treble in its sound profile, and so the noise was also a little bit higher pitched, but overall I would say you're fine recording audio internally on either of these cameras. Here's some samples of the audio and noise recorded on both of these cameras with their internal gain set all the way down and then just moved up 1 notch from off, and then I adjusted the gain on the external microphone, which was the Deity VMic D3 Pro, which I set to 6 on the gain, and then I normalized the volume of the clips in post. Test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test. Test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test. Now, the M50 does have a limitation in this regard that I alluded to earlier, which is that the audio levels don't show up on the display as an overlay on the video while you record. You can access them in the menu, but as soon as you get back to your regular shooting mode, you don't have the audio levels anymore. But in the RP, this is not a problem. You can see the audio levels while you're shooting. The RP also has a useful HDMI port where the M50 doesn't really. On the RP, you can pair it with an external recorder to exceed the 30-minute record limit, and it offers a clean HDMI out. The M50 has no such option and will always show your on-screen display info over HDMI. And even if you customize the display to minimize that information, the screen will still turn off after 30 minutes and thus end your HDMI capture. So the HDMI port is kind of useless on the M50 unless you want to hook it up to a TV to display your images or maybe record the operations of your camera. However, this combination of features on the RP makes it one of the best options for live streaming if you can supply it with continuous power via a dummy battery. It's full frame, so you can get wider shots if you have a restricted streaming space, and it has excellent low light performance and great autofocus, so it might just be the best bang for the buck streaming camera available. And if you use it for external recording, you can get 8-bit 422 over a clean HDMI with no record limits, so it definitely beats the M50 in that regard. And the RP also offers USB charging where the M50 does not. Now sadly, it's only for charging and not for active powering of the camera. Even if you use a USB-C power delivery device, it still will only work when the camera's turned off, which is unfortunate because if you could actively power this camera with USB, then it would definitely be the best streaming camera I've ever seen. Oh, and due to the reduced size of the M50, it does have this annoyance where you probably have to remove your tripod plate if you plan to use this on a tripod in order to open the battery door, because otherwise the plate is going to overlap on the battery door. But because the RP is a bit larger, I don't think it'll have this issue unless you use a really large plate. Lastly, while both cameras do offer a time-lapse video mode, which is feature-rich and the same on both, only the RP offers a true interval photo shooting mode, which allows you to capture raw images in a sequence that you can later on assemble into a time-lapse in post. There's also 2 annoyances on the M50 that weren't fixed on the RP, and the first is the silent shooting. Basically, there's no electronic shutter when in manual mode. You have to use the mechanical shutter. If you want to switch to a silent mode, mode, you have to go into the scenes, which are these automatic settings, and then choose the silent mode from there. So you can't set your exposure manually when using silent shutter. And this is kind of annoying, and it's something that I really wish would have been fixed in the RP. The second annoying feature is Canon's famously bad custom white balance tool. If you thought these new cameras would have a new white balance selector like every other mirrorless camera has, where you just point it at your reference and press OK, and then your custom white balance is set, think again. It still uses that same old mechanism where you have to take a photo and then load that photo up using the white balance tool and then assign that to the custom white balance state, for which there's only one, so you can only have one custom white balance, and then choose that white balance state in the white balance selector. This is weak and takes unnecessary extra steps and hasn't been updated in over a decade. But it's the same on both cameras. So I think that's everything that stood out to me. So which one should you buy? Well, if you really think you'll take advantage of the external recording or live streaming, or if low light performance is going to be important to what you shoot, or if you really just want to try these new RF lenses, then the RP might be worth the extra money to you. It's basically an M50 plus all that stuff. The stills image quality will be better out of the RP. Now you might not notice it as much in bright outdoor shots, but I think you will notice it indoors. Now I don't know if you're going to appreciate the quality bump enough to pay double the price, only you can decide that. But outside of those conditions, I'd probably consider the M50 to be the better buy, and it has its own strengths as well. With its compactness and better battery life, it'll probably make for the best travel camera, and it can really hold its own as a 1080p vlogging solution. Overall, both offer a pretty solid value, and it really just comes down to budget and which features are most important to you. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.